There's a popular saying that home is where the heart is, and for some people, this really does ring true. Home is where the memories are made, and that sentimental attachment is sometimes worth more than Edith Macefield. Nowadays, Seattle is known for being a large city that is the home of soaring skyscrapers, world-class coffee shops, and relocated sports teams. However, back in 1952, it was exceptionally smaller, and it was during this year that Edith Macefield bought a house for both her and her mother. Yet despite initially buying in what was just a very small suburb, after only a few years, a stone company set up shop close by, and soon enough the area was getting so developed that the two were getting more and more offers for their house. Yet they refused to sell, and this came to a head in the early 2000s when, after rejecting a $1 million offer for the 1,050 square foot home, a high-rise began to be built around it. It was at this point that Barry Martin, who was the development's construction superintendent, befriended Edith Macefield, who by this point was in her mid-80s, widowed and disabled. Against all odds, the two formed a friendship, with Edith often asking him to do errands for her to help her around the house. As a result, when she eventually passed away in her home at the age of 86 in 2008, she left the entire house to him. It was at this point that he sold the house for $300,000 to a local businessman in order to pay for his kids' college educations. Yet the businessman soon lost the house to foreclosure, and while the development owners did end up buying it, they have made the decision to not tear it down. Number 9. St. Joseph's Catholic Church. Churches are generally thought of to be sacred, and thus to tear one down wouldn't exactly leave a good taste in the mouth of the majority of parishioners. Such was the case when, in 1944, a company by the name of Josk's Department Store attempted to have the church torn down in order to build a massive superstore. Now, it must be considered that St. Joseph's Catholic Church was no ordinary place of worship. Located in San Antonio, Texas, it had been completed all the way back in 1871 and was made in a Gothic Revival type style that really set it apart from nearly every other building in the city. As a result, when the vote to tear down the chapel was brought forward to parishioners, they unanimously disagreed, and this called Josk's Department Store to simply build around the chapel, leading to it being surrounded on 3 sides by the store's walls. It was soon given the nickname of St. Josk's and has since received significant media attention. Yet despite its rather precarious position, St. Joseph's still stands to this day. Great. The $1 Million Corner. While most of the properties on this list were owned by regular homeowners, the $1 Million Corner stands apart due to it being owned by, well, a millionaire. You see, the land was purchased all the way back in 1900 for $375,000 by a man by the name of Robert H. Smith. Now, it's believed that he bought the land on behalf of Siegel Cooper, which was a company who believed that they had the largest department store in the world. That's because this property is located directly on the corner of the Macy's department store, located at 14th and 34th Street. And when Macy's tried to purchase the property from Smith, he refused to sell. As a result, in 1901, Macy's simply built their world record-sized store around this corner property. And this led to Smith eventually selling the land to a completely separate company for $1 million in 1911, which at the time was a record in New York for the most expensive price paid for a property. And while Macy's never did end up buying the $1 Million Corner, it still sits there today, and rather ironically, they have now negotiated a lease agreement with the corner property that allowed them to put up a giant Macy's shopping bag that says the world's largest store on top of its roof. Number 7. The Spiegelhalter Clock Shop. We've all had a case of having bad neighbors, but few can claim to be quite as ticked off by them as the clockmakers at the Spiegelhalter Clock Shop. That's because throughout the 1800s and 1900s, the shop had to contend with the department store Wickham's, which was a relatively large company that had set up shop right beside them. Now, the tension first began in 1892, when the Spiegelhalters agreed to move from 75 to 81 Mile End Road in order to accommodate an expansion to the Wickham store. However, in the 1920s, Wickham's planned to tear down their current store and instead create a massive complex. However, this involved buying out the Spiegelhalters, and this time around they refused. As a result, the department store simply built around the clock shop and hoped that they would go out of business before they did, so they could simply buy them out down the line. However, rather ironically, while Wickham's went out of business in the 1960s, the Spiegelhalters held on until 1982, when they too finally closed shop and ultimately got the last laugh. And in a rather amusing twist of events, although the former Spiegelhalters building is now roofless and derelict, it still stands to this day. Number 6. The Austin Spriggs House. While many of the entries on this list weren't exactly given the best offers for their properties, This was not the case for Austin Spriggs of Washington, D.C. You see, Spriggs used to have a small apartment at 433 Massachusetts Avenue, and in 1980 he began to use it as the office for a small architecture firm. However, by 2003, the area had become a hotspot for real estate, and thus despite the office building being valued for just $200,000, Spriggs was offered a staggering $3 million for the property, so that it could be torn down to make way for a new high-rise. However, he chose to forsake this golden offer and instead hold out in the hope of being offered more money. Yet unfortunately for Spriggs, the higher offer never came, and in 2011 he was forced to sell the building for $715,000 because it was going into foreclosure. As a result, despite Spriggs having the opportunity of a lifetime all those years ago, he let it slip right through his fingers. Number 5. Lu Baojian. We all have a dream home, and be it a massive mansion or a cottage in the sprawling countryside, at some point in our lives many of us hope to use our savings to make this dream a reality. Such was the case of Lu Baogan, a duck farmer by trade. In 2011, Baogan had finished his custom-built house for his wife and 4 relatives, with it having features such as wooden floors, built-in wardrobes, recessed lighting, and large windows with a view over the surrounding countryside. Yet he had only had it for 1 year before officials told him he had to leave in order to make way for a new road development. However, despite the fact that Baogan had spent the equivalent of about $110,000 in 2020 dollars to make the house, he was only offered about $40,000 for it by the government, and thus he promptly turned their offer down. And unfortunately for Baogan, rather than build elsewhere, this just caused the government to build around his home, leaving the house surrounded in a sea of asphalt. This soon caught the attention of the media, and thus reporters from around the world began to characterize the home as a symbol of protest against forced property demolitions. Yet this wasn't exactly the kind of attention that either Baogan or the Chinese Communist Party wanted, so soon after they settled for a marginally higher price of $46,000, with the local government also promising to help cover some expenses and help with some difficulties if Baogan chose to rebuild elsewhere. And while this decision was puzzling to many, Ying Zheyu, who is the Communist Party secretary of Zhajiangjiang village where the Lus lived, said that, quote, "He is not some so-called protester. That is just a name the media gave him. He did not agree to move before, partly because he was not happy with the compensation, but also he didn't realize the road project required him to leave. He thought it was just another property development project and he could still live there. Now he realizes he cannot just stay in the middle of the road, and he does not like being called a protester." Yet despite this explanation, we will really never know for sure whether Baogan was essentially forced by the Chinese government to sell his house, or whether the media firestorm caused him to do so voluntarily. On our end, we think it was probably a mixture of both. Number 4. Wu Ping and Yang Wu. Typically speaking, apartments are worth a pretty penny, and such was the case with a property that was owned by Wu Ping and Yang Wu of Chongqing, China. That's because ever since Ping's father had purchased a plot of land in the area in 1944, the family had, with one short exception, kept ownership of the building, converting its lower level to a popular restaurant while living in the apartment atop of it. Yet in 2004, the government began to relocate residents from the area in order to make way for a shopping mall, and out of the 280 homes in the $583,000 in an auction on July 31st of 2014 by Carl Icahn, who held the deed on Trump Entertainment and was the owner of Trump Plaza. Yet after making the purchase, he subsequently demolished the home on November the 19th of 2014. Number 2. Michael Forbes. Golf courses are easily one of the most scenic things to have a property close to, and oftentimes they can drive up the prices of homes located nearby. However, they tend to be not so great if someone tears down your property in order to build one. And this was the case with Michael Forbes of Aberdeenshire, Scotland. That's because in 2007, current American President Donald Trump was in the process of building a golf course in the area and hoped to get his hand on Forbes' land. However, after Trump presented an offer of what would today amount to about $750,000, along with an unspecified job at the course at a rate of about $80,000 per year, Forbes flat out refused and instead decided to spray paint 2 massive messages on his farm saying, "No golf course," and "No more Trump lies." As a result, Trump tried to start a massive smear campaign against Forbes.
Mr. Forbes is not a man that people in Scotland should be proud of.
However, this instead backfired when hundreds of people began to spite Trump by buying small shares of Forbes' land in order to make it harder for either the Scottish government or Trump himself to take possession of it. This then began to further escalate, as not only did many of Forbes' neighbors also begin to oppose Trump, but Forbes took it upon himself to get very close with the media to even begin flying a Mexican flag above his farm in protest. Ultimately, however, despite the media outcry and the condemnation of the course both by local officials and environmentalists in the area, the golf course was still built, with said course being opened in 2012. Yet thankfully, Forbes and his neighbors were never evicted from their land, and therefore the course simply had to be built around their property lines. Number 1. The Oka Crisis. While most of the examples on this list were relatively small-scale conflicts between independent property owners and major developers, the Oka crisis was anything but. That's because this was a case where the Canadian government tried to take away land that belonged to the Kanesatake people, who are an indigenous group that live near the town of Oka, which is located near the Canadian city of Montreal. Now, the issue at hand was the developers wanted to expand a 9-hole golf course into an 18-hole golf course with 60 condominiums to the side. However, the land they wished to develop on was a wooded area known as the Pines, which was a place where the Kanesatake would conduct ceremonies, play lacrosse, and even bury their dead. As a result, when the courts ruled in favor of developers in 1990, and the town of Oka tried to have the Kanesatake removed, chaos ensued. That's because in order to stop the development, the Kanesatake not only set up barriers to the Pines that were guarded with armed warriors, but also allied with the nearby Kanawake tribe to block off the Mercier Bridge, which was one of the most vital transportation routes linking Montreal's suburbs to its downtown. This led to the military being called, and rather than side with the Kanesatake, many white Quebecois residents wanted the military to go in and quash the protesters. This all came to a head on July 11th of 1990, when a soldier by the name of Corporal Marcel Lemay was killed in a shootout between the Kanawake and Quebec's provincial police. Yet by September 26 of 1990, the government agreed to some of the Kanesatake's demands and went ahead and bought the Pines from the developers for a sum of $5.3 million, which would be worth about $9.25 million today. And with this land now firmly in the hands of the Kanesatake, by way of the federal government, this crisis became a shining example of how indigenous people can not only make a stand against governments regarding their property rights, but can actually come out victorious.